We're here at the Texas Politics Speaker Series. I would like to briefly introduce our guests, although I think the people here largely know who they are. Immediate to my left is Erica Greeter, who is an editor at Texas Monthly, probably more prominently lately the author of Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right, What America Can Learn from the Strange Genius of Texas. And Erica's been a guest here before. We're happy to have her back. Next to Erica, Harvey Kromberg, the executive editor, owner, operator, and guiding spirit of Harvey Kromberg's Quorum Report. When you put it that way, I mean, it kind of says it all. Next to Harvey, Ross Ramsey, the executive editor, and as one of the young reporters once referred to me as the wise old owl of the Texas Tribune.
Right. I'll have to kill somebody now.
I'll never tell who it was, Reeve. So we want to get started. I want to start with you all by talking sort of generally, and start by saying, you know, when we look at politics, and I know this from all of you because all three of you are unusually thoughtful about this, there's often a kind of underlying dynamic that we're trying to capture as we're looking at the political landscape in Texas. If we went back 20, 25 years, it was how much longer maybe can the Democrats last? You go back another window, it's, you know, what is Texas going to look like after the oil and real estate crash, et cetera? So what are you looking at now? What is the underlying substrate that's driving things right now and that a lot of the stories are running through? And I'm just going to say, go with one area. Don't like make it hard for the people that come after you. So I'm going to start with you, Ross, because you're giving me such a funny look.
You know, the easy one here, I'll just grab the low-hanging fruit, is the split in the Republican Party. You know, 30 years ago, we were covering a one-party state that had two parties in it. And it was kind of generally talked about as the Connally Democrats and the Yarborough Democrats, the Tories and the liberals. And we have something like that in the Republican Party now. The people who used to be the Tory Democrats are now the traditional or moderate Republicans. We haven't really settled on a good label for them. And they've got this populist Tea Party insurgent movement, you know, exemplified by the Ted Cruz's and to a lesser extent the Rick Perry's. And all the game now is in March in the Republican primaries. And one of the things we're watching is kind of how that goes on a day-to-day basis and over a long period of time, whether it, you know, breaks off, whether it calves off a third party or puts a bunch of voters available to what has been a pretty dead Democratic Party for the last 20 years.
What do you think, Harv?
There's a growing sense of inevitability that we're about to become purple now. It could be this election, next election, the election after that. It's up for negotiation. But as the Republican Party continues to fight within itself, and at least right now, everybody is positioning themselves to try and be to the right of Senator Cruz, it creates opportunities for Democrats to accelerate that forward motion. And what's new about that now, of course, is the fact that we've all been sort of waiting for the evolution of the Hispanic vote, but the truth is that gender may end up trumping race and ethnicity in accelerating that push forward.
So you're going to say possible Democratic acceleration, but sneak in demographics too? That's kind of breaking the rules, but it's cool. I know how sneaky you are. What do you think, Erica?
I think I would second Ross's point about the Republican Party. There's been so much national and statewide attention focused on the question of, is Texas turning blue? When will it turn blue? Why will it turn blue? How fast? You know, what role does demographics play in that? But in the past 6 months, really, I think we've seen this incredible factionalization within the Republican Party, and it's startling to see because it's the other half of the equation, right? It's not Democrats winning, it's Republicans losing. And that doesn't mean Democrats win unless they start winning also, but it's just, you see a party kind of spinning farther and farther right of center, right of where the electorate is at, and that's really not a sustainable direction for them to be going in. So I've been kind of watching that with varying degrees of surprise, alarm, confusion, even some sadness, because it has been in some ways a good party, so.
Do you know, I kind of want to draw those together a little bit. Do you think that inevitably benefits the Democrats? That is the internal divisions, and I mean, that seems to be what Harvey's following. Well, you're sort of branded as expressing a little more regret than that. What do you think?
It's historically been so, in recent history, been so possible to overestimate the Democrats in this state. I mean, they're being handed a huge opportunity to compete for the center, which is the party that usually wins in the state. And thus far, at least in the cycle, we're not even seeing them try. So we have We have competitive elections planned or expected for the governor's race, comptroller race, but on the U.S. Senate race, for example, there's not even a Democrat declared, which is a startling omission in a state that's this big, that has a big Senate race coming up.
Harvey, I want to pick up a little bit on what you've all said, and I want to unpack this notion of the divided Republicans a bit, because it seems like we hear about that a lot, but I think often it's a little bit of a matter of perspective, or even almost like a Rorschach in terms of what you think the salient divisions are.
Right.
So, Erica, everyone's referred to that. Harvey, what do you see as the most important division or two?
Well, the metaphor is the Chamber of Commerce versus kind of a populist insurrection. One of the most startling things for business over the course of the last couple of years is discovering that Tea Party folks are not particularly their friends. And so right now we've got a recruiting process going on. It's not a very formal recruiting process, but business trade associations and individual business entities are looking for business-friendly Republican candidates, not Tea Party candidates. And so when you look at particularly in the Texas House, the open seats, the competitive seats, you're going to find school board members, mayors, Chamber of Commerce types, business leaders that have been recruited and encouraged to run in opposition to people who are more classical Tea Party types.
Is that makes sense to you, Ross? Is the thing that's really the main?
It does.
cleavage?
I mean, to me, the question is not necessarily whether the Republicans who are upset with the direction of their own party become Democrats. It's whether that section of the Republicans, however you label them, assert themselves. Right now, the people that are running the party are the people that run in a very small primary. It's only about 1.5 million that run in a Republican primary out of a citizen adult voting population of about 15.7 million. So only about 10% vote in the Republican primary, and they're the most Republicans. Almost 3 times as many vote Republican in general elections in Texas. So Mitt Romney gets almost 3 times as many votes as the number of people who voted in the primary. And the question is, are the November Republicans more moderate than the March Republicans, or are the March Republicans really where the Republican Party in Texas is? And so the first thing is, do the November Republicans, if they're different, which is a big if, reassert themselves? And if they don't, does everybody get so sick of this that the Democrats come up with a moderate candidate, which they haven't for a long time?
In some ways, don't you think the question might be, are the November Republicans, as you're putting it, different enough or moderate enough for that to really cause them a problem, or will party identification continue to carry the day for them, even if there are these swings?
It carries it in the general. It doesn't necessarily carry it in a primary. If they were to show up in March, it would be kind of interesting.
But one might argue that in the fall, it's too late, right?
I would say this is actually, it's a confusion that I think exists even among the candidates themselves in the Republican primary, right? I mean, you see a number of these statewide races where people are just scrambling. There's 3 or 4 guys in the race, and they're trying to get farther right, and they're not sure how you prove that you're really far right. Is it, I'm talking about guns or border security or abortion, or what is the issue? And it's like they don't quite know how to make themselves the candidate of the Republican brand, I guess. But they all think that it's somewhere over here. And a lot of them are actually still where they have been. They're still in the November Republican mode, but they have become, it seems, increasingly unwilling just to say that I'm campaigning on the economy and on these basic issues of state services and good government, and I'm not going to get increasingly frittered away with issues like repealing the 17th Amendment, which has been a sort of late-breaking public priority, I guess.
Well, the most recent solution basically is to take a couple of issues and combine it, right? So you take NSA surveillance and gun control.
Yeah.
It's counterintuitive, but where you see the rubber meet the road is in the smaller the political subdivision, the more likely you are to see a real battle between, again, Chamber of Commerce versus Tea Party types. In the last election cycle, the Republican primary, you thought that going into it that the Tea Party was going to be the dominant influence, but in fact, if you look at the Texas House, about 2/3 of the House members ended up being more pro-business than pro-Tea Party. Now, that doesn't mean Tea Party didn't have some impact on the way they voted, but it was more on the margins this last time.
Do you mean 2/3 of the House members or 2/3 of the Republican House members?
2/3 of the new Republicans
Right.
were more Chamber of Commerce type than they were Tea Party type.
Can I add on that point too? And I guess to Ross's point earlier, I think that there's this somewhat untested hypothesis among the party that that they win if they are deemed farther right by the primary voters, and I'm not sure that's true. You think about 2012, Romney won the primary, Dewhurst won the first primary against Cruz. Cruz won the runoff primary, but Dewhurst won the first primary. Speaker Strauss, Joe Strauss, considered a moderate Republican, has faced off primary challenges and challenges to a speakership. Governor Perry had a Tea Party challenge in the last primary he had in 2010. He easily won that. Even this past, a few weeks ago, the state voted for Prop 6, the water initiative, that the Tea Party was deemed to be against. Everyone else was pretty much for, and the state went for it by a 75-25 split, roughly. So I'm not sure where the proof is that people are taking to see they have to run to the right to win.
So Ross,
Texas
we've sat
Senate.
right here at this table. I'm coming to you in one. Go ahead. And finish
No, I'm just
up.
going to say the Texas Senate is, that's why I say the smaller the political subdivision, the
Right.
more likely you are to see the competition. The Texas Senate was more ideological in terms of its new members this last time, and it's likely to be even more ideological this time in terms of Republican members.
What's this table we sat at? What's the
Well, we sat at a table in this space a couple of years ago. I think Harvey was there too, and we talked about the Tea Party really at the beginning of this arc.
right?
And your position then was kind of they were small but loud. Do you still? I mean, is that kind of the explanation for this dynamic?
They had a big election in 2010. They had whether they were the reason for it or whether they were just the claimant of the victory in 2010, Obama had a really bad midterm election. The Tea Party candidates were big and loud and came out and claimed the victory of, they turned the Texas House from an evenly matched Republican-Democratic House to a very lopsided supermajority Republican House. And it wasn't necessarily a Tea Party House, but it acted like one. Once it got elected, they claimed that victory. They acted like one. Everybody was running to the right, inside, even in the small districts. And then you followed that a short time later with Ted Cruz knocking off David Dewhurst, who at the time was supposed to be the invincible big giant. Nobody can
guy.
bring this guy down. And right now, everybody, Cruz has become a verb. You hear Republicans say, I don't want to get cruised in the primary. And you even hear Republicans in other states say that. So whether the Tea Party is big or loud is sort of beside the point. All of the people in Republican politics are acting like that's the motivating force behind a lot of their elections. I will say here, though, that the guy with the best nose in the business, Rick Perry, caught the Tea Party thing very early in April of 2009. And, this is when he was accused of suggesting secession and all of this kind of stuff, and was kind of off to the races. And lately, watching the nose again, he is painting himself as the responsible brother in the family that Ted Cruz is in. Pay no attention to my little brother, give me the car keys.
Well, that does, in a way, that does kind of go back to Harvey's suggestion, and at least that one of the key cleavages is Chamber of Commerce versus grassroots populism. Although I would also suggest that there is something to. I mean, there's another element of this is that there is just kind of a dissident elite and ins and outs element to this, right?
Well, and there's also, the people that are ideological, and that's really the end of the game. And the people that are ideological and, this is where Perry's trying to paint himself, ideological and wanting to get something done, right? And if you, in our polling with you guys, it's showing up that people are sort of sick of the, would you guys do something?
His most recent political commercial, I thought, was brilliant in terms of nuance and shading. Actually, he's out there not just promoting Texas and trying
This
to
is
get
Perry's?
Perry, yeah, not just Texas relocations, but he's mentioning other Western and states that are governed by Republicans, and putting a stark contrast with Washington, which everybody, Gallup just recently said that Congress has a 9% approval rating, which means even their families don't like them, and it's he has morphed from a Texas pitchman, or he's trying to morph from a Texas pitchman to a national statement about there is a responsible way to govern as a Republican.
For the first time in quite a while, we actually don't have to spend the whole hour talking about the Republicans. So where is Wendy Davis in all this? What's our assessment now of the Wendy Davis, phenomena and where she stands going into the election? And I don't want to ask simply like, can she or can't she? I want to ask you guys something more from your perspective as reporters. That is, what's difficult? What's most difficult about covering Wendy Davis's rise and her entrance into the race?
What's been difficult about it so far is that because she came to statewide and national and maybe international notice because of an abortion filibuster, you can't say a thing about Davis without it becoming a proxy comment on the abortion wars, which are just thankless, I think, from all sides. But I think she certainly is the statewide candidate Democrats have put forward, or who has put herself forward for Democrats with the best chance in the past 10, 15, 20 years. No, not 20, the past 10 years at least. Even before the filibuster, she was widely thought to be planning to run, and she was starting to develop a portfolio of issues, including the Fair Pay Act, the Texas version of the National Fair Pay Act that Perry vetoed for some reason. And when the abortion filibuster came around, I think that gave her kind of a portfolio of issues on that side that hadn't really been issues in play in the past couple of statewide election cycles, and we'll see how that plays out.
You think, Russ?
You know, I wouldn't describe it as a difficulty. I think it's sort of interesting. You know, she and Greg Abbott both have these really interesting personal stories. They both have really great resumes. They're sort of both, you know, they're not hot politicians in the way that Ann Richards or Clady Williams or, you know, those kinds of people. This is TV era politicians. They're like really good suburban lawyers. And in some ways, they're not as interesting as their resumes. And one of the weird things about this, neither one of them is a great orator. Neither one of them is sort of I guess the passion is more in their audience than on the stage with these two. So some of it is they don't live up to the, you know, you look at the plaque on the statue and look, wow, this sounds great. You look up at the statue and it's not as big as the plaque. It's a weird race to cover. The other thing that is odd about it, and I guess is a difficulty, is sort of the presumption, you know, in our own minds and in the minds of the people that we talk to, that you're not taking this seriously, right? You know, you don't really think a Democrat can win this, right? And you end up talking about that part of the race instead of talking about the race itself.
It's actually absolutely true, is that any time that we've built a conflict where a Democrat could actually win, we've just been steamrolled right over. Right. But this is a unique moment in history. I mean, if you look at the number of women now in the United States Senate, there is something demographic, or not demographic, but something gender-based that is going on, and Republicans, at least the significant wing of the Republican Party, is playing right into it. To me, the most interesting thing about Virginia, which probably has no other application to Texas, was that the first issue when you polled that people cared about was the economy. Second was health care, and they split pretty evenly on that. But then when you got to abortion, and the Republican in that race had carried a fairly the same sonogram bill that we have here, and was hammered on it during the campaign, single men and single women broke hugely for McAuliffe. For the Democrat, and that was considered the margin of victory. Whether that's translatable in Texas is hard to know, because this is a much more expensive state to operate in. They have essentially one urban area. We've got multiple urban areas, but it suggests that there's something potentially tectonic going on.
Are you guys planning on doing any exit polls for this election?
No. Exit polling is tragically complicated and even more tragically expensive.
I live in fear of the prospect that we didn't have exit polls for the state in 2012, and if we don't have them in 2014, I mean, imagine the most plausible scenario is Davis loses by some margin, and we will spend the next 2 or 4 years arguing about whether that is proof that she lost because of abortion or whether it's proof that she did better than she would have done otherwise because of.
I don't know, but I suspect the National Consortium will probably do them this time, but we'll have to find out. That's a good question.
You know, one of the interesting things here is that the political professionals in the Democratic Party who might be riding this wave, who might say, you know, we've got a serious Democratic candidate running for governor, heck, I might as well run for attorney general, aren't showing up. And a lot of the people that, the names that come up, you know, so-and-so's waiting in the wings, everybody named Castro, you know, all of those kinds of things are saying, I think I'll wait until 2016 or 2018. And I think that that's one of the indicators that you have to watch. What are the political pros doing here, and are they going to stake their careers on this shot, or are they going to see how this goes and maybe I'll take my risk in a couple of years?
That's actually why I don't discount Davis. I think that she's not so much riding a wave as she is creating a moment for herself. And I think, as with Ted Cruz, now Senator, then not Senator Cruz, when he got in the race, it was similarly a totally losing proposition, according to any rational observer, except for Cruz himself, who just went ahead and ran and eventually won. So.
The one of the most interesting things about Davis is that the Obama coalition of millennials, women, and minorities went essentially untested in this in the last election cycle, except in her Senate district. Maybe Pete Gallego was trying to emulate that to a certain degree in his congressional race, but there were lots of sub-stories to her Senate race against Mark Shelton. But she captured women, millennials, minorities, and downtown business, and created a winning coalition that was the only laboratory that was tested in Texas.
In a lot of ways, isn't the guy kind of thinking about Wendy Davis's chance can it be simplified as really a question of change versus more of the same in terms of the underlying fundamentals?
To some extent, but the other thing here is there a constituency for something else right now? The downtown business people are with Abbott. There's not a reason to come off of that. So the people that were uncommitted in the Fort Worth race aren't uncommitted here. It's a question really of how do you build this thing? What do you build it up? When the Battleground Texas people came to the state and said, we're going to try to do to Texas what we did successfully in Ohio and Colorado and New Mexico, they also said, this isn't going to be a 2014 program. This is a 6-year deal. It takes a lot of time to knock on all those doors and to turn all those locks and to see if we can make this purple. The question for a Wendy Davis is not just, is this a good candidate? Is this a viable candidate? But do you have a ready electorate for this? And I'm not sure the second question, I think the business problem here may be the second question and not the first one.
You want to add to that?
Oh, no, I think that's absolutely true. The business community was somewhat of an anomaly. She had a long history in Fort Worth as a city council woman and had good relations with the business community. But I can tell you that the trade association people that talk to her have no problem with her per se. They just can't persuade their membership who default Republican.
Right.
And Abbott, I would say, is easily the best of the statewide Republican candidates. He's very smart. He's talented. He is probably the only one who's not trying to out Ted Cruz, which is not surprising because he has worked closely with Cruz. He was Cruz's boss for a long time when Cruz was Solicitor General. For Davis, I mean, and for any Democrat who's in a mood to capitalize on this, the Republicans are just on some of the issues where they're getting into kind of marginal stuff, social issues that are not generally the going priority among Texan voters or voters in any state. I think you could, at some point as a Democrat, build a campaign in the state saying, yeah, I'm not going to change much from the model because you actually can't, as governor, change the model that much in general, but I'm not going to do all this stupid stuff that's kind of a sideshow and a distraction that doesn't play well with most Texans. So.
Well, it does seem like Abbott has set out a couple of times to take a tack to avoid some of the headlong rush to the right that's happening in the other races. But do the other races pose a problem for him in that? I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, we saw kind of a rush towards the right on immigration in the lieutenant governor's race. And that did, in fact, bleed over into Abbott getting questions about his position on immigration issues and having to give questions that I think were, on one hand, honestly nuanced, but on the other hand, probably to a Republican base that is highly restrictive on immigration, potentially troubling. I mean, does that inevitably hurt Abbott or make headaches for the Attorney General or not?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think there's any question that Greg Abbott is going to have a difficult time getting out from the shadow of Ted Cruz and from Dan Patrick. I mean, he's flanked on the top and the bottom essentially by characters who are taking far more radical positions than he would like to. He may also have an issue here, I'm just going to hypothesize, that he to some degree is in a box because Tea Party types, which he needs to turn out in force, see any vacillation as betrayal. compromise is betrayal, vacillation is betrayal. And if, in an effort to get back to the center for those November Republicans, he weakens any of his positions or gets caught in the crossfire on immigration, or even the business community is not particularly happy about his economic plan, if he moves off of any of that, he faces the possibility of increasingly tepid support, which can be as fatal as a surge of support for Davis.
If it's framed like it is now, I mean, if the environment is like it is now, he's going to spend that race trying to wrap Obama around Wendy Davis's neck, and she's going to spend the race trying to wrap Cruz around his. If the situation changes, I mean, if you get to, say you get 9 months away from now and healthcare suddenly looks great, then the Obama thing doesn't work as well. If you get 9 months down the road from now and Cruz has seized upon an issue and something that makes people who right now don't like him, or lessens the feelings about him, then those become less effective. But right now, that's how the mix works.
He keeps coming up. Let's face this head on. What does Ted Cruz tell us about Texas right now? What does his success tell us about Texas?
I think the thing with Cruz that's funny is that he's, in some ways, he's closer to the center than a lot of the current statewide candidates, right? He's basically a fiscal issues kind of Republican. I think in covering Texas politics, we always get a little more granular about varieties of Republican than maybe our national colleagues do, but he's not one of the guys who's kind of constantly beating a drum about social issues or about weird, fringe issues. I mean, he in the campaign against Dewhurst and continuously, his biggest issue has been Obamacare, which is not really a culture wars issue, it's a fiscal economic issue. So I think in that sense, Cruz is actually not out of line with Texas tradition. He certainly has been received as being much more far right, and I think people who are far right see him as somebody who totally gets their concerns. And he is conservative socially also, but as far as what he's bringing forward, he's been much more focused on the economy in the same way that the state party has been historically.
Yeah, but couldn't you argue that he's able to do that because his credentials are so well established on those far right issues?
Well, how?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody has any doubt that he's an evangelical. He's promoted that pretty straightforward. Right. I don't think there's any doubt about his abortion politics when he's been asked.
It would be surprising if a social issue came up that he voted to the left of any of the other.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. He's conservative, but as far as what he's campaigning on, that's not what he's campaigning on. It's not what he campaigned on in 2012. I think on they're both pro-life, for example, but I think Dewhurst is arguably more likely to advance pro-life causes than Cruz would have been as lieutenant governor in that counterfactual. I mean.
Well, of course, he's never been in a position where he had to negotiate nuance.
So,
and if you're the lieutenant governor, you do have to consort with known Democrats, which of course is the kiss of death.
Yeah, I mean,
to your question, I think Texas always has had a really strong middle finger vote, and the part that wants to thumb their nose or flip the bird to Washington is embodied in Ted Cruz. I mean, they sent him up there to raise hell. He's raising hell. We see in our polling that that's working with the people who elected him. It's like, go get him. I think what it says about Texas is that they're mad at Washington, and they sent a guy up there to tell Washington just how mad they were.
Well, I mean, I think I would also say that in terms of the Obamacare issue, I mean, if you look at the polling we just did on health care, what you see is that the Republican response is highly negative to Obamacare as a label, a package, as a concept, as a political symbol. When you unpack it, their feelings are much more mixed.
Yeah, they like a lot of the pieces.
They like a lot of the pieces. They don't like the pieces that actually are necessary to make it work. But that doesn't sort of change the fact that their response to Obamacare may be driven by something other than a calm, rational assessment of the fiscal issues attendant to Obamacare.
Well, the risk for Cruz, of course, is that the site starts working and that people start getting claims paid before the next election, and all of a sudden, all the argument kind of dissipates. The pollster for George W. Bush that was involved with the Medicare drug program
Part
rollout,
D,
Part
right.
D, exactly, said that it was a political disaster for them for 18 months. The site didn't work, people couldn't get registered, et cetera. But the day that people started getting claims paid, it stopped being a political issue and started to be a consumer issue. And that actually has peril for Cruz because it would undermine his essential reason for existence.
Is that his essential reason for existence?
I don't know if it's his essential reason. for
Overstatement,
existence, I guess that's possible. I think we'd all prefer to see a law that is passed work well than not work, or than fail to work as much as it has seemed to fail in the first few months of it. I think if it becomes a great success, though, somehow, I'm not sure how much that devastates Cruz's ability to argue in general on other issues. I mean, it just means he was against a law like a lot of Americans were. He argued against it. It ended up working out okay. On to the next thing.
Move to something else, yeah. And he's got plenty of time. I mean, the presidential is in 2016, and he's nosing around Iowa and the other states, like a lot of them are. But he's not on the Texas ballot until 2018. He's got a lot of time to do, change his tires a couple of times here.
Right, it's one of the things about the Senate that's actually terrific, right?
Right.
You have a lot of room to move in the interim, right? So what else is brewing out there? I mean, it seems to me there are big storylines that we've talked about pretty well, but we're going into what is essentially a state level primary and then a state midterm election. What's out there you think people are missing right now that's not getting talked about because there's all this other stuff going on?
I think we're in the early stages of rebranding Rick Perry. And he's trying to establish a different storyline between the 2016 presidential election and oops. So build something new. He's got a couple of years to do it. He's got on his glasses, which we all know adds about 40 points to your IQ, and it does. It worked for me in 5th grade. It's great. And he's doing these things. The sort of the more responsible member of the conservative family to Cruz, on one hand, the crack he made to ABC News about Chris Christie will see if a conservative in New Jersey is a conservative in the rest of the country. So he's put down a marker there. I think we're seeing the rebranding of that. And the other sort of quiet story I think that's rolling right now is John Cornyn, if everything rolls just right or just wrong, depending on your politics, Mitch McConnell gets in trouble or gets beat in his primary, John Cornyn is the one who rose quietly to the top of the United States Senate. We've got a loud one and a quiet one, and this one's the number one Republican in the Senate.
I think to me the most fascinating future story is what the shape of the legislative dynamic is going to be after this election. The Senate, we pretty well, with the exception of 1 or 2 seats, conceivably know what the composition is going to be. We don't know who the lieutenant governor is going to be yet, but it looks like it's going to be a battle between Dan Patrick and David Dewhurst today, long time before we get there. But legislative politics are always about 2 against 1. Governor and lieutenant governor against speaker, speaker and governor against lieutenant governor. And we're going to have 2 novices in key positions, and one who would have thought it, wise man, experienced person in a leadership position in Joe Strauss. And Strauss is controversial in the Republican Party, but he's about getting things done. We're going to have an ideological Senate, and I'm willing to bet at the moment a fairly pragmatic House. So how that mix all works out is pretty interesting.
I'm interested to see how the kind of current libertarian strain, and that actually I think is the best part of the Republican Party right now. Not the best part of it, but it's kind of an undervalued part of the Tea Party phenomenon is the libertarian component of it and what they've done, even in the past session on privacy rights and that kind of issue. I think that was a good story for the state. It was the thing that worked well and the thing that they were quite good at leading on, and they'll continue, I think, to advance that. And I also would second the point about Rick Perry. I mean, I don't know if I think his national prospects have really taken a hit because of Ted Cruz's ascent. But I think we'll look back at Perry as somebody who was not at all a bad governor in practice. And it is interesting how he's pivoted from talking about, for example, fiscal conservatism to fiscal responsibility when he's arguing for more investment in infrastructure and water and roads. I think he's been somebody who, partly because he seems so far right and he seems unquestionably far right, has been able to be a slightly moderating influence on the state. I'd like to see 1 or 2 of those guys come out and just openly be a moderating influence or openly say, this is what I'm concerned about, this is actually a key issue, and not try to pad that out with the various embroidery we see. But I think that's an interesting phenomenon too.
I really like the embroidery metaphor, but I'm not going to pursue it too much further. Although I mean, maybe I am in a way. I mean, as we wind down, before I open it for questions, you raised the question of Perry's pivot to suddenly his re-embrace of infrastructure, if you will, after having been burned on it in the middle of the decade on transportation, sort of shut down any kind of spending, purge discussion of the Trans-Texas corridor from even from any existing law. Used the fiscal austerity in the 2011 session to prepare the ground for his run, but then kind of circled back.
Right.
And embraced water transportation to some degree, and now, what you were talking about, this national messaging he's doing. Should we read something into the successful water vote and Perry's pivot in terms of the larger fights we're talking about? Are the business and trade groups and what I hate calling the business community because it munges too many things together, but are the business folks fighting back?
Well, yeah, I think the center's fighting back too. I mean, the thing with the water vote was that, I think I've heard good arguments about how that was structured and the idea of, taking rainy day funds as opposed to GR appropriations. I mean, that's fine as far as it goes, but the controversy about that, or the opposition to that, was premised on a set of numbers about state spending that were just so distorted and so willfully misleading, that were produced by certain right-wing groups and that somehow were disseminated widely, even though they were numbers that reflected when money was appropriated, 2011, 2013, as opposed to what was spent year on year. If you think about what the state has actually spent, we've had a pretty modest rate of spending growth relative to our population growth and inflation. It's on any, I think, reasonable examination, a pretty conservative spending state. I think the huge vote in favor of the water bill reflected that those blatantly bad numbers didn't actually have the traction that the far, far, far right, or whatever we're calling them, had hoped they would.
I think if you're out there being an economic pitchman and you're trying to get business relocation, there's a certain attractiveness to low tax and low regulation. But at the end of the day, you've got to have sufficient infrastructure to get goods to market. You have to have a reliable electric grid, which we don't, and you have to have sufficient water. If you're one of the most loyal Perry constituencies has been home builders. You can't build subdivisions unless you've got water. And I mean, it's that clean a deal. And so you're out being a pitchman trying to bring relocations here. And any serious business is going to say, what are these three issues going to look like in 4 or 5 years?
We had a serious pitch from a cash-strapped Department of Transportation to replace some paved roads with gravel roads. And if you're out in California or Missouri or Maryland or any of the other places Rick Perry has been pitching Texas, and the other governors are holding up baggies full of gravel. It's bad stuff. You've got to do the things that you promise to do when you come here. The water, when people have to stop watering their lawns, when you have
or drill a well.
Well, right. If you get an oil well, it's an offset. But it's kind of the Battle of St. Augustine. I fought for my little patch of green here, and you're telling me I have to shut this off because you didn't do a water plan. And now the road out there is gravel, and you're taking money away from schools. You have to do those basic things, or it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. They'll throw you out.
I want to ask one last, even though you can't really see any of your belly buttons. I want to ask you to look at your belly button just a little bit, at least, mentally, not literally. I could see a lot of people watching this and saying that whole discussion there, all that business about government's got to spend money on this stuff, is just because everybody's sitting there. You got some pointy head from the university and a bunch of reporter types. They're all really just part of this inside discussion about, the way things should work, that it's all very kind of part of the establishment and part of what's wrong, the mainstream media, for lack of a better term. I mean, do you guys feel the pressure from that discussion? Because it feels to me like, because of developments in media, that is out there much more, that we all are considered kind of part of the problem. Are you feeling that?
As a pollster, you know it's the follow-up question that matters. And as a journalist, that's the follow-up question that we live in a world of bumper stickers and 140 character headlines. So you can drive a lot of passion one way or the other on very abbreviated, but I talk to groups that are fairly ideological all the time, and it's the follow-up question that suddenly makes the light go off. So I guess there's some pressure, but we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't like the follow-up question.
You did one of these with Jim Pitts, and Jim Pitts, before the 2012 election cycle, was talking to a group in Waxahachie, and it got on videotape and went viral within this little bubble of people that are interested in government and civics. And it was him talking to a group and saying, we're going to have to cut. It was before the 11 session. And he said, we're going to have to make some cuts. And the problem is that the things we promised to deliver and the taxes that we have promised not to raise are now in conflict. And so we're going to have to make some cuts. We're not going to raise your taxes, but we are going to make some cuts. And it kind of came around to a guy in the audience raising a hand and saying, you mean that you're going to cut some nursing homes here and my friend over here is going to get kicked out? And Pitts, being a good politician, said, well, I don't think your friend's going to get kicked out, but somebody is. And the problem in government, whether you're an insider or an outsider, is they have a set of promises that they have made. And they've said, we're going to do these goods and these services, and we promise not to raise the price of this or this or this. And at some point, those things come into conflict. And really the hard part and sort of the essential part of governing is balancing those two things. And to say that they're going to have to either raise taxes or turn off the water on your lawn is just realizing that out loud. I think I don't really feel any pressure about it.
So
I think the people who are elected to make those decisions feel some pressure about it.
So you would say, you're not inside, you just have a mature view of the trade-offs. Right? I mean, that's what that sounds like. I mean, roughly.
Well,
you said something similar.
I would say it this way. I don't think you can look at the whole field of decisions that they have to make and not realize that they're going to have to figure out which of their promises to break. Do I tell you we don't have all the water we promised? Do I tell you that we don't have all the pavement we promised? Or do I tell you that that thing about raising taxes and fees is off?
What do you think?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I don't think I'm part of the problem. I think I'm fine. I think when I put the book out this spring, I went and did a lot of book talks and had a lot of questions and answer sessions with various audiences that were both left-leaning, right-leaning, et cetera. And I would say the same thing to any group. I would say the same thing to anybody about what I think about things. And I found in general, people I think have been pretty open to these discussions. I think it's a pretty easy case to make if you have a state that's done very well economically. It's had tremendous growth economically and in terms of population in the past 10, 15 years. You're going to need to make more investments, not just per capita investments tracking population, but things like build some new schools, build some new universities, build some new community colleges, extend some water supplies. I think that's not an especially esoteric or pointy-headed case to make, and it hasn't played that way. But I do have very, very smart readers, so.
Well, of course you all do. All right, I think on that, we'll go to a smart audience and take some questions. Questions from the audience. Let's start right here, and then we'll go back to Tim. And again, if you'll wait for the mic, that's great. The mic from Mike.
Hi. I was hoping that you guys could talk a little bit about Texas's decision to reject Medicaid expansion and kind of the arguments that were made for that, specifically the financial arguments versus the ideological arguments, and kind of maybe what was going on underneath everything. And in your opinion, do you think that the financial reasons and those arguments that were made to reject are actually sound? In your research.
What happened with the Medicare?
Well,
decision?
Medicaid.
Medicaid.
Yeah, the prospect here was that if Texas would put up $15 billion over 10 years, we would receive that and $100 billion more back. And a lot of people looked at that and said, let's jump into that, let's grab that money. The countervailing argument, the non-ideological countervailing argument was, we don't have confidence in the federal government to be able to continue the programs that money would addict us to. And it would be a bigger mess if we took the money and it fell apart than if we didn't take the money at all. so let's don't take the money at all. The medical community, the sort of the big silos, the Texas Medical Association, Texas Hospital Association, groups like that, were all for it. And a lot of the economic development people in the state were all for putting $100 billion into the economy in any industry they could put it in. But the Texas and I think 25 other states at the moment, I think it's 25 to 25, and DC took it. They all sort of bought that argument that this is an unsustainable program that we shouldn't participate in even for a year or 2 years or 3 years.
I think it was rhetorical for the most part. It was rhetoric for the most part. It was associated with President Obama, and we were very busy raising a fist towards anything that President Obama was affiliated with. The appropriators, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and the House Appropriations Committee were ready to rock and roll. We didn't have to take all the money, but there were certainly targeted applications that would have worked. When you don't take the money, you're cost shifting down to local communities, and we had it's the one thing the legislature is really good at is cost shifting, and there was a lot of pressure from those communities that uncompensated care, uninsured folks it's the most irrational form of health care out there, and that local property taxpayers were going to pick up the burden. And we've demonstrated more than once that we're perfectly happy to end a program if we don't have funding for it. So it rang false.
I think this is, I think there was a good substantive argument that could have been had about it that Ross sketched out. I mean, that's a real problem, especially in a state like Texas where there's so many kids in public schools. And if you're talking about a constrained revenue picture and you're trying to expand Medicaid, assuming the federal money goes away at some point, then really your only choices are to end the Medicaid expansion or to cut public schools, which would really be a false economy for Texas. But I think to Harvey's point, it was not a discussion that was had in those terms because of this aforementioned Tea Party phenomenon where people seem to have the idea and the ledge the whole time through that the Tea Party caucus, which was known to exist but poorly delineated, was somehow much bigger than it actually was. We saw in later votes towards the end that it actually was quite small. It was like 4 people in the Senate, maybe 16 in the House. But at the end of the day, the discussion, I think the House had enough votes, more than 80, to pass the Zerwas plan for expansion, which was a Republican bill that would have expanded Medicaid or taken the expansion, and then kind of given Perry the room to grudgingly acquiesce to this legislative decision. But because there was this sense of the Tea Party will revolt and they'll just, mess up everything else while they're at it, it didn't get out of committee, which was, I think, really a shame because we could have had that discussion.
We'll all get cruised.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's some individual incentives there. I mean, I think that has to do with the psychology of the legislators, which is not necessarily their. I mean, I think there was a matter of not knowing just how big the caucus was, but it's not so much how big the caucus was as how many people would be motivated by fear and conflict avoidance.
And once the governor put a marker down that we weren't going to do it, there was no political upside to challenging
Yeah.
the governor.
There were also, one other thing you got to throw into this is that half the legislature was looking at higher office. The prospect was that Kay Hutchison left, Cruz got that job, Perry's going to leave, and that means this guy's going to move up and this one's going to move up, and all those jobs open up. And you've got, several senators and several House members during the session thinking about, looking in the mirror when they put on their makeup or shave every morning going, that's a president right there.
Yeah.
And wanting to move up and not wanting to take a vote that they thought might mark them in that tough Republican primary coming up.
And if you look, and that was at least a rational expectation if you look at the lieutenant governor's race and the
Right.
attorney general's race right now, right? Yeah, Tim.
Thank you all. What are your impressions of this Regent impeachment investigation, and how do you think it might end?
I think it's the speaker is. There were the votes on the floor to probably impeach during the session, but that would have created a civil war among the leadership. And Strauss's strategy was to go slow, go so slow that Perry, you drag this out until Perry is such a lame duck that he's a non-factor in all this. And they're doing a magnificent job of going slow. And all of a sudden we're talking about potential criminal investigations, referrals to district attorneys, and I don't know that there may be a vote to impeach. I doubt that we'll ever see an actual Senate trial.
Okay. What else? I want to go over here, and then we'll go back to Paul. Yeah.
Hello. Given the scope of the conversation, trying to read a little bit into the tea leaves here, does Texas become, 2, 3, 4, maybe even the next election cycle, become fertile breeding ground for the resurgence of blue dog Democrats at the national level?
Not until it's safe to run in the primaries. I mean, not until they think it, you'll know that it's, the leading indicator that this is a swing state is somebody will break through that you don't expect to. Maybe Wendy Davis will win, or, maybe she'll get 47% in a state where people have been getting 41 or 43, and it'll light some people up and say, hey, that's interesting, or they'll see a particular change in a particular key county, or, something like that. That'll be the first piece. The second piece is that you'll see candidates saying, I think I can win there as this. Let's say I'm flexible about whether I call myself a Republican or a Democrat, and I'm young and I'm ambitious and I'm deciding to go into politics, the first choice is which flag am I going to run under? And the problem with the Republican flag, all other things being equal, is that it's really competitive over there. Everybody's over there. You got to run over 700 people to get to a decent job, but the Democratic field is completely open. Heck, I could run for U.S. Senator today and I'd be the first guy in the chute. So the minute that becomes viable, it's the easier path if it's viable. And I think the first thing we'll see that's an indication that the state's a little bit purplish or maybe blue is you'll see some political entrepreneurialism jumping into those kinds of races.
I thought in the last decade, the most amazing thing I saw was the level of energy and heat inside the Democratic Party in the 2008 primary between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Records were broken. There was all of a sudden the sense that there was actually a pulse to the Democratic Party. They had a fresh mailing list, which is actually the mother's milk of politics, which they never used again, as best I can tell. But that was a potential inflection point that was wasted. It seems to me, and right now Davis can shuffle the deck based on gender, and maybe Hillary Clinton comes down and excites the Valley, and we can all kind of hypothesize different things, but the party itself doesn't really have a pulse yet, and it's an enormously expensive state to play in. The low talk is that Davis can raise $30 to $40 million, which is competitive, but there's no infrastructure, there's no organization, and redistricting further undermines the Democrats because it's destiny for the next couple of election cycles that we know what the House is going to look like, we know what the Senate is going to look like, and we know what the congressional delegation is going to look like. So the only battlegrounds on the statewide level.
I think it's a great question. I think that when we see some of these Texas Democrats emerge in Congress or at the city level, where a lot of them are, or statewide, they won't be blue dogs, though. They'll be more like Rockefeller Republicans, redescribed as Democrats. And we already have a couple of people like that. Mayor Anise Parker in Houston, Beto O'Rourke from El Paso, the congressman, I think is one of the more interesting members of the delegation. So yeah, I think, and we'll see how the National Democratic Party responds to that.
Paul.
As much as I'd like to get your opinion about direct election of senators, there was a really fabulous piece that Nick Lemon wrote in the New Yorker this last week about Doris Kearns' new book about Roosevelt, Taft, and the journalists that were the muckrakers and the McClures 100 years ago. And it's kind of like a golden age of the press, where the press had a gigantic impact on public policy. And if you go to the 1960s, 1970s, you can trace environmental policy, civil rights policy to the role of the press. In the 16 years I've lived here, I've been astounded at the lack of issues having any kind of much of an impact, actual policy issues on elections here. In Virginia, the sonogram bill was a big deal. Sonogram bill over here, if it impacted any elections at all, at least up to now, I didn't see it. I'm curious what you guys see as your role, the press, in terms of, do you have a connection in terms of just the way people read? I mean, I read all you guys, but is the public reading the press now? Is the public actually caring about issues? Or are we so partisan that the issues are actually not that relevant, and that it's all social issues and demographics, and sort of like Bill Bishop's Big Sort, we're all going to certain places where the issues are irrelevant? Or are we coming back to something if we ever have a two-party system here?
They had this great thing on the Daily Show the other night. It might have been last night. These things all blur together. But Colorado voters recalled the Senate Majority Leader, I think, over a couple of referenda on a couple of restrictions on guns that turn out in their polling to be approved by 60 or 70% of their voters. And so this guy does these things that are approved by these voters, puts these restrictions in place that really, really tick off some small group, and they decide to have a recall election, and the recall election worked, and they yanked the guy out. So the Daily Show sends reporters on the street, sends a couple of reporters on the street, and it's completely anecdotal, but it gets to the point, which was, do you support these restrictions on gun control? And, yeah, absolutely, I do. Well, would you support a guy who got these into law? Absolutely, I would. Well, did you? No. They didn't vote. You know, you've only got 10% of the citizen adults voting in the Republican primary, and that's the big one. The Democrats only turned out 688,000 people for their primary in 2012. To Harvey's point, they turned out 2.4 million in 2008 when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were on the ballot. Where'd those people go? There's 1.7 million that they didn't call back, that never came back. I don't think the voters are engaged here.
Well,
But I want to re-ask Paul's question. Just get it. So, what is your answer to his question? Though, are people reading what you're doing or not?
That it's not evident in the elections that those are the topics of conversation that voters are moving on.
But Ross, why would voters have turned out on the Democratic primary side in 2012? I mean, 2008 was this fantastically captivating election. I mean, these great narratives on both sides, and it actually
Right.
mattered in Texas.
They had a great race.
Yeah, but so if you stayed home and didn't vote and you're a Democratic voter in 2012, that doesn't mean you're not engaged. It means
What's
you
the
knew
evidence
there
of
was no
engagement if you
suspense.
didn't vote?
Well, you could observe that Obama was going to be the nominee for the Democratic Party for re-election, right? So, and was there any contested races that would have captured that? I mean,
It seems like the Democrats would get those voters to turn out maybe in a general election.
I'm going to quote the immortal Ken Herman, who, when we do panels together, is the editorial columnist for The Statesman. One of the first questions he always asks is, how many of you still read a newspaper, an actual newspaper, 2 or 3 times a week? And maybe a quarter of the people raise their hands, and he says, okay, now we know who's over 60. And ultimately, the truth is that people are not reading long stories, and so if you don't read long stories, you can't pick up on nuance. Television and the internet are still the primary sources, and brevity is rewarded, not long developed stories. I was stunned the first time I did television 20 years ago. They told me that the original demographic was at least high school diploma and actually the first couple of years of college. Now they're talking about 1 year of high school as the demographic for television news. And I think that probably says almost everything you need to know about engagement.
I would add too, though, that I don't think as a journalist, I don't have an agenda. It's not my job to promote an agenda. But I think people do engage still with longer investigations or long form reporting. This month we saw, for the first time in 75 years, a prosecutor go to prison in Texas for his role in with suppressing evidence in the Michael Morton trial, which had, about a quarter century ago, resulted in Michael Morton going to prison for a crime he didn't commit, which is a horrible story, a really tragic story, and one that my colleague Pam Koloff has covered at great length for Texas Monthly. So I think that was a case where it didn't seem like it was going to be a widely followed story, but she did great reporting, and people really saw that story and responded to it, I think.
You know, there's another door here. One of the things that's interesting about the Wendy Davis moment, when she sort of pops up, is you get this live stream that at the peak, 182,000 people are watching. And so you've got people acting on the floor of the Senate, people watching it, people, you know, an abundance of people in the room hollering, but people outside the room hollering and Facebooking and tweeting and all of that in a way that the people on the floor were seeing it while it was in action. So it actually became a real-time thing, and the wall between observer and player disappeared, if only for a little while. And one of the things that we'll see maybe in this election is whether the engagement that was evident that night, you know, in that particular form of journalism becomes an engagement that continues through an election cycle. But, you know, the point I was trying to make is that you put this out and a lot of people read it and a lot of people see it, but oftentimes that's as far as it goes. It never becomes really the subject of the conversation in an election, and so you don't really see engagement about the tenements in New York or about the trusts or all the things that she was talking about in her book.
Ross always talks about, you can tell the surprise issue of a legislative session is when the TV cameras suddenly appear out of nowhere, and it's usually something that none of us were watching for. And of all the things that are going on right now, the first thing that I get asked pretty much wherever I go, and I bet you have the same experience, was the impeachment question. Right. What the hell's going on with the University of Texas and the governor?
Why are those Aggies tearing down UT?
On that note, I want to thank Ross Ramsey, Harvey Krumberg, Erica Greeter. Great conversation. Thank you all for coming.